In 1914, war broke across Europe, and almost every continental power was dragged in it, in what was a struggle for power and assertion of global influence. Although its immediate cause was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, the powers of the world were already moving towards an armed conflict. America was neutral at first, the diverse populace being divided between supporting the Central Powers or the Entente, although numerous instigations made the American government to declare war on Germany. In this video, we are going to look over the causes that dragged America into the war and how its presence influenced the course of the conflict and subsequent peace deals. At the outset of World War I, in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson declared that the United States would remain neutral, a stance that resonated with the majority of Americans. The country had a long-standing tradition of avoiding European conflicts, dating back to George Washington's farewell address, which warned against entanglements in foreign wars. The diverse ethnic makeup of the US also made neutrality a practical choice, as many Americans had ancestral ties to the nations involved in the war. Despite its neutral position, the US maintained economic relations with both the Allied and Central Powers. However, the balance of trade heavily favored the Allies, particularly Britain and France. American banks extended substantial loans to these nations, fueling their war efforts and creating economic interdependence. The British naval blockade of Germany further tilted American trade away from the Central Powers, as it effectively cut off supplies to German markets. While the US government insisted on its right to trade with all belligerents, the blockade and the reliance on British and French orders made neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. One of the most significant early events that tested American neutrality was the sinking of the British passenger liner RMS Lusitania by a German U-boat on May 7, 1915. The attack resulted in the deaths of 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. The German government justified the sinking by claiming that the ship was carrying contraband war materials, but the loss of American lives sparked outrage in the US. President Wilson issued strong protests to Germany, demanding an end to unrestricted submarine warfare. In response, Germany temporarily suspended its aggressive U-boat campaign, seeking to avoid drawing the US into the war. However, the incident hardened American public opinion against Germany and marked a shift away from strict neutrality. As tensions grew, the preparedness movement, led by figures such as former President Theodore Roosevelt and General Leonard Wood, gained momentum. Advocates argued that the US needed to strengthen its military in anticipation of potential involvement in the war. In response, Congress passed the National Defense Act of 1916, which expanded the Army and National Guard, and the Naval Act of 1916, which authorized significant increases in naval construction. While the movement faced opposition from isolationists and pacifists, the growing threat of German aggression in military preparedness a more palatable policy. By the time the US entered the war in 1917, its armed forces were better equipped, although still relatively small compared to European armies. A decisive factor that led to American intervention was Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917, facing supply shortages and believing that cutting off Allied shipping could force Britain to surrender. Germany announced that it would attack all ships, including neutral ones, in designated war zones. This policy posed a direct threat to American vessels and trade interests. Around the same time, British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, a secret communication from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. The telegram proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico in the event of US entry into the war, promising Mexico the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in return. The British shared the telegram with the US government, and its publication in American newspapers in March 1917 caused national outrage. The prospect of a hostile alliance on the southern border further galvanized public support for war. The Imperial German government has committed repeated acts of war against the people of the United States of America. Therefore, be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the state of war between the United States and the Imperial German government, which has thus been thrust upon the United States, is hereby formally declared, and that the President be, and he is hereby, authorized and directed to employ the entire naval and military forces of the United States and the resources of the government to carry on war against the Imperial German government, and to bring the conflict to a successful termination, all the resources of the country, hereby pledged by the Congress of the United States. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson addressed Congress, calling for a declaration of war against Germany. In his speech, he famously stated that the world must be made safe for democracy. Wilson framed the conflict as a moral struggle against autocracy and militarism, positioning the US as a defender of democratic values. On April 6, 1917, Congress overwhelmingly approved the declaration of war against Germany. A few months later, on December 7th, the US also declared war on Austria-Hungary. The decision to join the war marked a departure from America's isolationist traditions and set the stage for its growing involvement in global affairs. With war declared, the US faced the challenge of rapidly mobilizing its military and economy. The Selective Service Act of 1917 introduced a draft, ultimately conscripting over 2.8 million men into the armed forces. The American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, led by General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France in significant numbers by mid-1918, while Germany was moving on with an offense. On the home front, the government launched a massive propaganda campaign through the Committee on Public Information, CPI, headed by George Creel. The CPI used posters, films, and speeches to rally public support for the war and promote enlistment, war bonds, and resource conservation. However, the fervor also led to the suppression of dissent, exemplified by the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which criminalized criticism of the government and war effort. The arrival of American troops provided a crucial boost to the exhausted Allied forces. By the summer of 1918, over 1 million US soldiers were deployed in Europe. American forces played a key role in major battles, including the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which contributed to the eventual collapse of German resistance. Beyond manpower, American industrial and agricultural production supported the war effort, supplying food, weapons, and equipment to the Allies. The infusion of resources and morale from the US helped turn the tide of the war, culminating in the armistice on November 11, 1918. After the war, President Wilson played a leading role in the Paris Peace Conference, advocating for his 14 points and the creation of the League of Nations. However, despite Wilson's efforts, the US Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, primarily due to opposition from isolationist senators who feared entanglement in future European conflicts. As a result, The US did not join the League of Nations and instead pursued a policy of relative isolationism in the years following the war. This reluctance to engage in international commitments would influence US foreign policy until World War II. The American entry into World War I marked a turning point in global history. It demonstrated the nation's capacity to project power on an international scale and set a precedent for future interventions. The war also accelerated domestic social changes, including the expansion of government power, shifts in labor dynamics, and advancements in civil rights movements. While the immediate post-war years saw a retreat into isolationism, the lessons learned from World War I influenced American policies in the decades that followed. Ultimately, the US emerged from the war as a burgeoning global power, laying the foundation for its leadership role in the 20th and 21st centuries. The American entry into World War I was driven by a complex interplay of economic interests, security concerns, and ideological commitments. While the US initially sought to remain neutral, escalating German aggression and geopolitical realities made intervention unavoidable. The contributions of American forces and resources were instrumental in securing an Allied victory, reshaping the global balance of power. Though the post-war period saw a return to isolationism, World War I marked the beginning of America's transition into a leading world power, a role that continues to shape international relations today.